Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sencha Cafe. This is Stephen Ball here, and I'll be hosting, moderating through today. Joining me online for the main content, as always, is Stuart Ashworth. Good morning, Stuart.
Morning, Stephen. Morning, everyone.
So, firstly, just a quick thank you to everybody for the comments and the feedback we've been having through from the series so far. And, building the whole kind of application from scratch, all the way through, showing the different stages, different iterations of the data, and especially kind of last week in terms of integration to the RESTful data that was being persisted. A few interesting comments around kind of the use of RAD server there as well, which I think people found quite interesting and having a look further at. So that's great. The replays, I will be getting them available. We are having a problem with some of the access on one of the accounts at the moment, just to get those uploaded. But as soon as we've got that sorted, I'll make sure that the links are shared around to everybody who is registered for the events. So I do apologise for that delay. In the meantime, if you would like to have a temporary link to it, please drop me, Patricia, or Stuart an email over, and we can make sure we get those links over to you. Okay, as normal, let's just do a quick poll because we are fully live, just to help us understand who's on, so we can just tailor some of this as we go through. What best describes your use of Sencha at the moment? Are you not using it, actively trialing it, using it in development, or using it in development and production? Okay, so just around about half of you using it in development and production. Around about a quarter of you, or just under a quarter of you, not using it yet. So great that you're here to find out a bit more. Okay, I think we're pretty much there on everybody voting on that, so I'll just give that a few more seconds. Okay, great. And let's do our next one. Especially for those of you on Sencha, which version are you currently using? So just a reminder, on version 6 and before, version 6 is just now moved outside of the active support. It's now kind of passive support. So it's like a 2.5 year window from release of the next major version. So I definitely recommend getting migrated and upgraded through if you're on 6 or before to the latest version. If you need any support or guidance on that, or you want to have some time with somebody like Stuart, then we're more than happy to help you there, give you guidance and point you in the right direction to help you move forward. So please do feel free to message through. And in fact, we'll get Patricia to put her email address into the chat. So if you have got any direct questions, she can get you connected up directly with this time. Okay, a pretty good split. About a third of you on version 6, about a quarter on version 5, and a quarter not using it yet, and then the rest up on version 7. So that's pretty good. Okay, our last poll, and then we'll get into the main event. Which toolkits are you using? Obviously, we've been covering in this series both the classic, kind of the desktop browser type toolkit, and also the modern toolkit, which is ultimately designed up to work on more modern browsers with touch user interfaces as well. And we've been showing how to be able to work with both. So a pretty even split, I think, quite considerable based on who we got online and the versions they're using, but just over half of you using both, and the rest predominantly on the classic toolkit. Okay, great. As always, those bits of information really help us in terms of guiding what we're going to be pointing out and the key things that we cover as we go through. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Stuart. For the session today, we're looking into the deep linking with ExtJS and how you can kind of get directly into specific entry points in the applications. So over to you, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well this morning. As Stephen said, we're going to be talking about deep linking in ExtJS applications. We've just got a few. Let me just go forward. So today, quick overview of the session. There's a few slides here. I'm going to talk about deep linking in general and what it is and how it fits into ExtJS and single page applications in general, and then we're going to go forward and start working on adding some deep linking routes to our XMail application that we've been building over the last few weeks, and we're going to try and get that working, adding deep linking to it as a sort of retrofit, and so we can start to add a few routes, different types, and some of the features of the routing classes. And then after that, there's plenty of time, hopefully, for questions and answers. If anyone has any during the session, just fire them into the webinar software, and we'll try and either come to them at the end, or I can answer it if it's something relevant to what we're talking about at that moment. And if there's anyone is keen to have a quick chat at the end, then we'll maybe try and open up things and have some chat about how we're using deep linking, any questions, that sort of thing. So first of all, what actually is deep linking? So basically, in simple terms, it's allowing users to go directly to a section of your application via the URL. So in traditional applications, web applications, you would, the different sections would have their own URL. So you'd be going to the myapp.com/users/view/123, and that would be a deep link to that section of the URL. And traditionally, that would be an actual page on the server that would be served up and populated with that user's details. And that is what deep linking is. And there's different ways that is being adapted to be possible in the single page application world of ExtJS. So single page applications, they kind of fall outside of that traditional model of the web, because they're one index.html page and everything just happens with the JavaScript library in the background, and everything is rendered on the single page. We never leave that HTML page. And so these deeper links don't really make sense, because we're not going to navigate to a new page. So the single page application is going to break that traditional thinking of how the web navigates. And they also break the back button, which is quite an important thing that users tend to be expecting to work and can have sort of adverse consequences when they do use it. So if they load up your application, they go to a section of the application, and then they think, I want to go back to where I was before. They click the back button and they get taken back to whatever page they happen to be on before, and the whole web browser will move off your application, and they'll go back to Google or their email or wherever they were before. And that can cause a lot of frustration to users, because even though they know that maybe it doesn't work, it's a force of habit to do it. And also our single page applications, as I said before, they don't have a single entry point where the users start their journey, so there's no way to go in to a different place of the application. You either you load the home page and you get taken to the dashboard or the login page or whatever that entry point is, and there's no way to go straight into a certain section. So by adding deep linking through sort of retro means, there's a lot of benefits to it. So as I said, it maintains this sort of standard web navigation concept, which users are familiar with, and it becomes more of a natural extension of the web. And it also keeps the back button working, which, as I said before, is really important. It keeps this sort of natural habits of users in place and working, and it avoids frustration with that being broken. And it also allows different parts of your application to be shared or bookmarked, so you can jump to those really quickly. So if your users are looking at a certain report, they could copy the URL and paste it into their chat and send it to one of their colleagues, and they could open up that link and go directly to that report with those parameters and see what the other colleague was looking at straight away, rather than having to be say, right, go into the application, go to the reports view, enter these parameters, pick this report, etc., etc. And that is a lot quicker workflow and is really useful for the end user. So how does deep linking fit into ExtJS? So as we said, ExtJS is, we build single page applications with ExtJS, so we have to add in this concept of deep linking via the framework. So there's a set of classes called x.root.x, and there's a set of classes there that bring this functionality to the framework. And what this does is it creates deep links, rather than being a full URL path, it creates deep links via a URL hash. So you can see on the screen here this example. So it goes myapp.com, then there's a hash, and then everything that follows the hash is the sort of deep link that will be used by the application to open the correct section. So it's sort of the same as if that's hash was replaced with a slash. That would be the sort of traditional way of doing it, but this using the hash means that you never leave the actual page, but internally the page will change based on that hash changing. And just like a full URL, you can copy and paste this into the browser and refresh the page, and it will it will stay there, and the framework and your application code can pick up the values and parse them, and trigger the different bits of code that are needed to populate that view and bring it to the front. And that's what we're going to do in our little demo application in a minute. So there's a number of features of the ExtJS router that are really useful. So we can define multiple parameters in a route. So you might have an ID or a name, or all these different things that can all be added into the route name. So that means that we're really powerful for getting deep into the part of the application that you want. We can also have optional parameters. So you might have parts of the link that you don't always need, so they can be marked as optional and will be parsed accordingly. And we can validate parameters to make sure everything's in the right format and sort of ignore malformed URLs. We can also have multiple simultaneous routes, which is a really useful thing in single page applications, because it's not, there can be lots of things going on at once. You can have multiple windows with different types of screens showing. You might have a user's window that's open, you might have a documents window that's open, and so you don't, you're not necessarily focused on one or another. So you can have multiple routes that can have these things existing simultaneously. So you could have a user's route and a documents route existing together, and they can be triggered independently. And we can also define before guards, which is basically code that we can run before the route gets triggered. So we can do things like checks that permissions are correct. We can make sure things are loaded correctly before we start looking for them, that sort of thing. And that's really powerful for letting us make sure our routes are robust and the application is in the right state for us to follow that route. So without further ado, I will get stuck into to demonstrating what we're going to do. So this is our application that you've probably seen before, and hopefully be familiar to you from previous weeks. If it's not, you can grab the code. I've got a link to the code that you can have a look at the end. And if you want to have a wee look and see how things are put together, you can do that. And obviously, Stephen said that the recordings will be available soon, hopefully, so you can look back and see how we built this. So basically, this is what we're going to try and build. And you can notice that we've got already got a URL hash in here. So it says label/inbox. So this is saying that we want to show the inbox label in our list view, and we can change to say the all mail. The view refreshes and our URL changes to all-mail. Similarly with drafts and sent, these all change. And if we navigate into a message, sorry, we'll see that we've got a view part here, which says we want to view message ID 335. And if you look closely, if you can see there's a pipe character in there which separates the multiple routes. So in this case, we've still got our label all mail, which is saying that we're still in the all mail label. We just happen to be viewing a message at the same time, and that means that when we hit this back button, it will take us back to the correct label. And equally, if we refresh our page, we should see this message reappear because we've deep linked to it. Oh dear, it's actually been taken off. We'll figure that out later. But it's showing our message, and if we go back, we get back to the all mail. And likewise, if we compose, we get a route called draft/1, which is the ID of this draft, and that gets shown in the window down here. So that's what we're going to aim for today. So there's going to be 3 main routes that we're going to add. We're going to add one for showing the label, what label we're looking at, one for the drafts, and one for viewing the message individually. And we're going to demonstrate that just now. So come back to this page here, which is our local Sencha app watch just running, and this is the application running without any routing. So as you can see, nothing changes in the URL, and we can navigate around fine, but if we refresh, everything gets changed back to the original state, which is fine, but we want to add deep linking to it. So what we're going to do first is we've got our application here. Hopefully everyone can see it. Maybe bump the text size up if once we open some things. Let's bump this up a little bit. Oh, that's better. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new field to the label model. So this model holds all these labels on the left, and they all have sort of nice human readable names, but we need a name that can be part of a URL. So we don't want to have spaces, for example, and we want it to be all lowercase. So what we're going to do is we're going to quickly add a slug field to the model, which will be a calculated field, and it'll just take the name and it'll sanitize it a little bit so we've got something we can work with. So we've got a calculate field. We're going to take the name and default it an empty string if it's empty, just so we don't get any errors. We're going to make it lowercase. We're going to change spaces into dashes, and we're going to I can't remember what that regex does. I think it takes away any non-letter characters. So that'll get us a nice URL friendly name for each label. So we'll save that, and that's that bit done. And then we're going to add our routes. So we do that, and we add routes to the view model, and by default the routing capabilities is built into the view model class. We can also use a mix-in if we want to add routes to sort of component classes, but we're not going to do that today. We're going to stick to using them in our view controllers. So this is our main controller base class, and this is a base because it's shared between the classic and the modern toolkit. So everything that gets put in here will be shared among the classic and the modern toolkit. And so we should see that the routing all works in both, which is really powerful. So to define the route, we just define the routes config, and it takes an object, and we can give the key for each item in the routes object is the sort of pattern that the route will take. So we're going to start with our labels route. So we want it to be label / and then we want it to be the second part of the route to be the label's name, or the label slug, sorry, that we just created there. So we're going to use the syntax here where we do a colon, and then that will become a variable name, and that sort of is a placeholder for that parameter. This will be familiar if anybody does back-end work. This is quite a common syntax to use when defining routes in like Node.js applications, that sort of thing. And so we can give this an object. We can also just give it a string name, and that will be like on handle label. And that will be resolved to a method called on handle label in the class itself in the view controller here. and that would work just fine. But because we want to be put more features in, we're going to use the object syntax and define a few other things. So we're going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it label. This just means that we can refer to it later on. So it's something we're going to have. And we're going to put before guard in. And we use the keyword before, and we just give it a method name. We're going to call it on before view label. And what this will do is before if the view the root matches this one, so if it finds label / inbox in the URL, it will the root will match, and it will say, right, we've got a before function, so we'll run that first, and before we actually do the real action logic, and we're going to give that a method name here too. So we're going to call that on view label. So this before will run, and then once we've done what we need to do there, the action will then run. So we're going to put these two methods in. If I can find them, I'm just going to paste them in and then talk through it, save the typing. So on before view labels, this is it matches this definition here, and it takes two parameters. The first is the label, which is the parameter name that we've got here. If you have multiple parameters, I think they will come through as an object and be keyed by the name here. And the second is an action class instance, which is basically a sort of class that represents this root action, and so we can call actions on call methods on that to progress the root path. So in this case, we're using the action.resume function, which we'll talk about in a sec. So in our before label root, we want to make sure that the labels are available to be looked up. So if the label store hadn't loaded yet, we wouldn't be able to check, find the label in the store based on the parameter name, and then we wouldn't be able to select that in the list. So we need to make sure the label store is ready before we can carry on. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab a reference to the label store, which is in our view model, and we're going to check if it's been loaded yet. So if load count is greater than 0, then the store is ready, and we can move on to the next step and we'll call action.resume here. And if it isn't ready yet, then we'll add a single use load handler, and when that load handler triggers, we'll then call action.resume because the store is loaded, so we can carry on and do our next set of logic. So that's something that we use the before guards for. And similarly, things like you could hit the server and say, does this user have permissions to access this particular root or this particular label, and that could come back as false, and then you could say bail out of this root logic. So that's a really useful thing to use. And next we can add our on view label function, which is going to actually handle the root and take us to the right place within the application. So on our view label function, one parameter, which is the label again. So in this case, it might be all mail or inbox or starred. And we will grab the store and we'll look up a record based on that value. So we use the slug as the lookup field, find the label record based on that. And if the label record doesn't exist, so it's a non-existent label value, then we're just going to grab the first one and use that instead. And then once we've got that label, we can sort of set up the application to use that and get it in the right place, in the right state, to show the correct information. So in this case, we want to set our selected message to null, and that is used if we've drilled into a message to see the details of it. We'll use the selected message property. So if we change label over here, we want to be able to go back to the list view and cancel this viewing of the message. So we do that there, so that will then take us back, and then we set the selected label to the to the one that we've found, either the first one if there was none or no matches, or the one that we found based on the slug. So that's that in place. So now we should, I don't think we've got a few more bits to do, but we can, that root should be matching now. So we can see that we're now in the all mail. We just refreshed the page and it pops us into the all mail label. So that's basically set up that root already. There's nothing much more to it. You know, we've done our check, make sure the labels are actually loaded, find the label that the root refers to, the parameter refers to, and set up our application state so that it uses that label. And all our work that we did in the past will trigger the views to show correctly based on that label. For example, the messages store will be filtered and show the right things, and this item is actually highlighted because we've still got our binding between the selection and the tree and the selected label property. So that all still happens in the background. All we're doing is that our root is triggering it rather than our internal application logic. And the last thing we want to do to finish up with this part is we want to change the selection, the label selection change. So at the moment, if you click here, this will change because our selected label is changing based on our binding, but our URL isn't changing. So we need to tell the application to change the route that we're on when these selection changes. So we do that with by binding to the selection change event of the labels tree. So we're going to add a new function here called on label selection change, and we're going to use this, and we're going to bind this to, we'll set up in the classic. So we find the main view, and we've got our labels tree here, and we're just going to add another listener to selection change, and enter our new method name, which will resolve to here. And we're going to grab the first record because it gives us an array of records. And if we've got one, so it might be null, it might be deselected. So we check that we've actually got one and we get the slug. And then we do our redirect. And this is where we actually trigger the router to change the route. And there's a few ways to do this that we'll talk about quickly. The simplest way is to just pass in the URL or the root URL part directly. So we could just say label slash and tack on the slug. That will change our URL to the new root, and it'll trigger the root, and it'll hit our new functions we put in and change everything to the correct new label. But because we want to support multiple routes, and further down the line here, we are going to use this different syntax. We use the object syntax, and that lets us change multiple routes independently. And that's where these names that we used up here come in, so we can actually target individual routes that might be present. Sorry for scrolling fast. So in this case, we want the label route, which is the name that we put in the top, and we want to give it this new label, and we've just used a string format so we can sort of add the placeholder and inject the slug name. So that will change the root name to label slash all mail, for example, or starred. And the other thing we're using here, which we haven't set up yet, but we're adding a message name here, which is one we're going to set up in a minute. And by setting it to null, it will remove that any message root part from the URL. It will remove that and navigate us away from the message view, so that we will go back to the home list for that label. So that's how that works. So if we've got an existing URL root set up that matches this name, it will replace it. If we have one that's null, it will remove it, and if we have one that doesn't exist, it'll add it on. So that's the sort of three options there. So if we refresh our app, So we get taken straight to that label, and hopefully if we click on one, we now see that the URL changes as we click through. And if we refresh, that stays the same, and we get taken to that label. So that's our first label route set up. It's worth sort of quickly talking about our sort of application design kind of changes a little bit when we start adding deep linking, and because everything has to be triggered by the URL change and the route change, we can't sort of do internal logic in the same way. You know, we can't just say, oh, let's change the active screen here to a different view. We have to, instead of saying, right, change the view, we have to say, change the URL, redirect to that route, and let the route do the changing. So it's a slightly different mindset to get into, and it's possible you'll have to rework a little bit of your sort of navigation handling logic to satisfy that new pattern. But hopefully it doesn't take too much changing if you're adding this in, after already building your application. Okay, so with our label there, we can now move on to our message route. So we want to be able to click a message in here and have it obviously show in the details pane here, but we also want to be able to see that message ID show in the URL so that we could potentially share that URL to someone else. So we're going to create a new route here. We can just stack up as many of these as we like. So we're going to call it view / and we're going to grab a parameter of the message ID. And again, we're going to use the object syntax. We're going to give a name of message, and we're going to have a before guard of on before view message, and we're going to have an action of on view message. And these can just get popped into the view controller just as we did before. So I'll just paste in the before. So in the exact same way as the labels, we're going to check that the messages store is loaded and only continue to try and fulfill our route if it has loaded. So do the exact same thing. We grab the messages store, check for its load count. If it's loaded, we resume. If it hasn't, we wait for the load and then we resume. And that means that the message records will be in the store ready for us to actually access. And very similar to the labels, the on view message handling, we get our message ID passed in. So we grab the store, we grab the message record, and we set the selected message to the message record. And if we didn't find a message record here, if it was null, that get by ID returned a null. If it was a nonsense ID, then selected message would get set to null, because we obviously can't view it, and then it'll take us back to the we want to take it back to the list view. So if the message record is falsy, then we use that syntax where we assign the message route to null, which removes it from the URL and takes us back to the previous screen. So to get this figured out, finally, we just need to change a little bit of logic in our handle message click, because at the moment we're handling a click here with this function, and we're showing we're setting the selected message, but because we want the routes to handle it, at the moment we're doing this sort of internally. Like I said before, we want any sort of interaction that triggers a new view, we want the route to handle it, because we want it to go down through the routing system. So to do that, we need to update this message handle message click. So what we're going to do is, instead of doing this set here, we're just going to do a redirect instead. So we're going to redirect to, we use our object syntax, we're going to use the message key, which is the name, and we can use the message records ID that we're getting passed in here and pass it to that to this pattern here. So view / and then the ID will get put in that placeholder. So there, I think if we refresh, and click on one of these, we'll see that we get taken to our new view, and we've also got a view /6, which is the ID and the view part of the URL. And you'll notice, like we said before, we've got two routes active at the same time. And we have got that because we've used this object syntax. So we've targeted a particular route, the message route, and given it a value. And so because the message route didn't exist, it just gets tacked on to the end of what is there already. If we just use a simple string and said redirect to view /6, it would sort of nuke out all of the existing routes, take them off and replace them all with this one route. But because we want to keep that intact so that when we go back, we will maintain the label state, the label that we're looking on, we'll keep that in place. So that's the clever thing about the object syntax. It gets us multiple routes. So with that in place, the only thing we want to update is the back button, because if you click back, it's still doing sort of internal logic, and it's not removing the view route that we've got on there. So we want to be able to take that off. So we're going to find the back to message grid. So this back to message grid just selects message to null, which resets the sort of navigation that we want to. As I said before, we need to sort of rely on the we want to reset the routing as well. So to do that, we can just say redirect to message null, and that will strip off that view part of the route and take us back to the message list directly. So if we go back to there and then we click through, and if we go back, we see it come off and we come back to our last view. So that's pretty good. So the last route we want to add is the draft route. So when we click compose, we take a slightly different logic. Rather than showing it in this sort of detail screen here, we have a pop-up window. And we want to be able to trigger that differently than just clicking on a message that already exists. So to do that, we're just going to add a third route called draft, and we're going to have it have an ID property too. Just check. Yeah, so it's going to have a message ID. So basically, when you click the compose button, it creates a message record in the background and sticks it in the store. You can see it's got a 1 here beside the drafts label. So as soon as you click compose, you've created a message that will then be saved in your drafts. So that means it's already got an ID that we can make use of. So we're going to call it draft, and we're going to give it, in fact, we don't need a before hook because we don't need the stores to be loaded to be able to create a new one. We can just stick a new one in. So we'll just define an action and call it on draft message, and then we'll create that function in our view controller, because that these strings always get resolved to the view controller that they're in. So on draft message, this is we've got a bit of logic here, because although we're hitting compose and opening a new draft message, we might have gone into the drafts and clicked on here, and we still want the draft window to pop up. So there's a chance that we're dealing with a message that already exists. So we get a message ID coming through the route. We find it in the store, and if it doesn't exist, then we remove the draft route that we have. So if the message ID doesn't exist, we throw that away and go back to where we were before. Otherwise, we show the draft window and pass in the message record. And if we find, we've actually renamed this from compose. So if we find compose window, we need to rename that draft window. That is a method which we've got as a placeholder for our toolkit specific implementation. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our classic views main controller and add that logic there. But first, we're going to just quickly place these couple of names just so we've got that's going to work still. So we go to main controller and we have a show compose window. We're going to change to show draft, and we're going to not going to do too many changes here. All we need to do is when we close this window that gets popped up, we want to reset the root because that's effectively a back operation. So we're going to do close, and we're just going to add a quick inline handler. And we're going to do this dot redirect to, we're going to use the object notation again. And we're going to say draft is null, and that'll take us back to the original place and close the draft window. So now if we refresh our page, hopefully, oh, I've got an error here. Oh, ignore that, must have just been catching up. So we'll hit compose now. Oh, hold on, we've missed something. We need to update the click handler that's in here. So let's find the compose method. So we come from here, so this is where we're going, and we get triggered into here. So at this point, instead of showing the draft window, well, we are just showing the draft window and it's popping up, that's fine, but we're not doing the root change. We're not letting the root do the showing. So we need to change this slightly so that instead of showing the showing the window, we want to trigger the root. So we're gonna, instead of doing that there, we're going to take that away because that we call that show draft window as part of the root handling. So we want to just do the root handle, the root redirect, sorry. So the redirect to the draft name, pass in the draft with the message record that we want to look at, which has just been added here in this logic here. And that will then trigger the window to open. So if we go now, we can compose. Now we get a draft /1, which is the new message ID, and that will open up there. And now if we close the window, that draft /1 gets taken away. And if we go back to the drafts and then click here, as you see, we don't get the drafts part updating, so we need to go back to there and change the logic that's handled when a message is clicked. So in here, when the message is clicked, we go straight to the draft window, but we want to use the root to trigger that and not just do it internally. We want it all to flow through the root logic. So we do a redirect here to use the object syntax, and we pass in draft. And just passing the message record ID into the draft root. And now if we create a draft, so it'll disappear, we close that down, see the draft come up here, now we click on it to open it again, and this URL will update and give us that draft as part of the URL. In this case, because there's no backend to this, refreshing this won't find that record draft1 because it doesn't exist. So that's something that will need to come once we get when we have the API integration backend, which we talked about last week, but I've left out of here just for simplicity. But if the backend was there, we would be able to look up the message from the message store. And in fact, if that was the case, we might need to go back and add a before guard to our drafts route as well that says check the message store is ready, and then look up the message ID. And that lets us get all the way to having those three routes. It handles all the main interactions in our application, the viewing labels, that persists those, viewing the records, the message records, and it gives us a nice deep link to that, and also to the compose And as you can see, we can have all three at once, and they'll just stack up. And as we start to remove them with that object syntax by setting them to null, they'll start to drop off as they move around. So if you see, if we click back in this sort of interaction, we've lost the view slash message ID, and we're left with the draft and the all mail. If we were changing the label that we're selecting, we can see it changing there, but the draft doesn't change, that remains in place. And likewise, if we close the draft, we lose the draft part of the URL, and that keeps everything nicely in sync. So that's a quick introduction to how we might add routing to our nice little email application. Hopefully it's been interesting and you've learned a few things. If there are any questions, I think I saw a few pop up. We can answer them now. I hope everything was quite clear. Oh goodness, there's lots of questions. Hopefully Stephen would have interjected if any of them were relevant to something in particular that we're talking about. But I'll try and go through them now, or Stephen can triage them for me. Thanks a lot for listening. And I'll put the, in fact, I'll just jump to it now and you can copy it down. And GitHub, Xmail, you can grab the code there. There's a branch called deep linking. In fact, there's a PR called deep linking. If you want to look at the code that we've just worked on today, that's basically where I've been looking at from. So that'll see all the code that has been added to get it all added in. And if you want to have a look at that, jump into there. Otherwise, hopefully see you next week, and we'll go through some questions now.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, quite a few questions that we've been just sorting through. We posted the links for the temporary links, should we say, into the chat for those who are attending live. You posted the link there for the repo, which we've also pushed through. There's a couple of questions slightly off topic, but one of them was obviously just asking around the IDE configuration. I know we've kind of covered that before, but asking specifically if you've got any experience of using ExtJS with Eclipse, and any advice in terms of using it with Eclipse.
I haven't used Eclipse for a while, I'm afraid, but I mean, I expect there'll be sort of general JavaScript plugins for Eclipse that will allow you to get some sorts of IntelliSense type things set up. But otherwise, it's just a nice text editor, so it should just be the same as using like the VS Code that I'm using here. What did you don't remember, Stephen? Was there an Eclipse plugin for ExtJS? I wonder if there was. I don't know if it's still.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
It might be worth looking into, but I think there is an Eclipse plugin actually. If you
there's an ID. I'll put the link in the chat.
So maybe that's worth getting installed. I don't know how if it's kept up with the newer Eclipse versions, but certainly worth having a look at, or just general JavaScript plugins for Eclipse will probably help. Help speed up your coding.
Yeah, so on there it mentions the requirements around Eclipse, Luna, Mars, Neon, Oxygen, Photon, using Sencha command 6 and above, and ExtJS, well, the latest versions says 4.2 and above, and 2.1 touch, so obviously that's quite a while back. But yeah, there's some notes on the documentation. So I put the link into the chat there for that. Oh, managed to lose my question pane. Question here also, I see you use Atom IDE. What kind of package plugins do you have?
I don't actually use Atom. I used to. This is VS Code that I was using today.
Yeah, I was going to say it's VS Code.
Yeah. But there's, I think when I did use Atom, I just used sort of general JavaScript things. I don't think there's anything ExtJS specific.
Okay, Peter's asking here about the if you have a big nested app and state preservation in the URL hash, is there any limitations, for example, length?
I think there probably is a length limit. I mean, we're probably talking a lot longer than you'd likely need unless you've got a really big application. I think Internet Explorer had a 2,000 odd character limit, so you're probably
2048.
I'm sure you've seen some horrible monstrous links that you get sent around from like Amazon and stuff, and they're pretty long. So I think I don't think there's really a realistic limit that you'll hit. In terms of other parts, you need to conform to URL characters and things. So I think it's sensible to be restrictive in what you use. Although URLs can have, I mean, they can have emojis these days. Probably better just to stick to alphanumerics, and if you can, just to avoid any parsing problems and that sort of thing, and differences in browsers. I think that would be sensible. Like I did with that wee slug I put on the URL. I think the spaces and the capital letters probably would be fine, and they'll get encoded automatically. But it means you don't have to deal with that and worry about it. So it's best to try and keep clean URL friendly items in there.
Okay, great. Another question here is any hints or tips around validation of link parameters?
Yeah, so you can add. So we define our parameters in the root name. There's a useful property called condition, which lets us define each parameter and give it some special validation and processing before we use it. So I think I'm in the router code documentation here. Let me just search root conditions. So there's quite good docs on here, so we can. So for example, we want our message ID to just be a number. So we could give it a regex to just be 0 to 9, and that will prevent any characters being put in. Likewise, we could put in a proper pattern to be a GUID pattern or something like that. Also, like down here, we can add some operations to it before we get our parameter out, so we can split it. This is an example of a file name, so we can split it by the dot, parse it by extracting the first part of it that we want, that sort of thing. So it's really useful to be able to sanitize what we're getting in as these parameters, and also to do a wee bit of logic on them before it enters the root conditions.
Okay. Obviously, we're showing here the evolution of the email client that we've been building over the weeks, keeping it simple and adding kind of other concepts and structures in as we've been going through. But do you have any advice in terms of building a new application, if you should plan your routing from the start to put it in, or as you've shown here, to kind of once you've got the core functionality there, then retrofit the routing into the application at that point?
I think it's easier to do it at the time, because you can design the application in terms of the entry points being the routes, and it focuses you to funnel any actions through the routes rather than calling sort of methods internally. So like, for example, these show draft calls that we had to sort of weed out, we were showing drafts through various different parts the application. And so if I'd put them in from the start, I would know that to get a draft to show, I would do a redirect. And so I would do that wherever that was needing done. So it's not impossible to retrofit it. I just think the sort of mindset and design you come to would be easier if you did it from the start.
Okay,
because
cool.
it's a bit complicated.
Okay. And are there any, obviously, any specific benefits around doing that to help manage the code between the classic and the modern?
By adding it at the start, you mean?
Yeah. In terms of when you add it in.
I don't think so. Certainly, if you add it at the beginning and you were sharing a lot of the code between the two toolkits and having a universal application, it would be good to have that in from the beginning, because then it's even less complicated when you're trying to deal with two toolkits and two sort of small code bases. So I think it would be easier to get it in at the start, or at least have it in the back of your mind.
Mm-hmm. Another question here from one of the customers. So I'm not going to try. It's a European name that I'm not going to try and butcher. So, asking, are there any security considerations in terms of adding in the routing?
There shouldn't be. Obviously, you're potentially making it more obvious how IDs and things are loaded. So rather than it being sort of obscured by the through clicks of the application, it's actually put it straight in front of you on your URL. So I guess make sure there's no sensitive information in the URL itself, in the hashes. IDs generally are okay, because your backend should be doing the heavy lifting on the security front, checking that whoever's loading it has the security. Obviously, we talked about the before guards being used to check security, and that's probably quite a good thing to add if you have restricted sections of your application. But you have to remember that anything on the front end, the client side, is accessible anyway. So as long as you're handling it properly in the back end, you shouldn't have any sort of breaches to worry about. But as you say, keep sensitive stuff out of the hash parts of the links.
Okay, another question here. I've got an application that's quite large and uses dynamically loaded packages, and want to start routes on packages loaded dynamically. Any advice there?
This is a bit tricky, because in the past I've found that the routes don't, the views have to be there for these to sort of trigger the routes. And with dynamically loaded packages, things aren't there when the route triggers, if you like. So I don't really have a good answer to that, I'm afraid. Although I do, I'm sure there's been a talk in the past by Nils Dell, who's I think is an MVP too, and he talked about dynamic packages and routing. So I think I'll try and dig out that page, because I had it open recently when I was preparing this. So I found it here, so I'll paste that in the chat. He talks about dynamic package loading and routing, so there's hopefully some answers in there. But I don't really have a good answer for you, I'm afraid.
Okay, yeah, I guess the only thing potentially, I don't know if this would work, would be to have a kind of like a dictionary that you could reference from any of the packages. So if you see something coming through, you could validate and check and say, okay, I need to go pull this package through here, and then get that package load up dynamically from based on what's in the dictionary. But it's not really kind of based on the actual packages, and it's something to kind of keep in sync. So I don't know if that would work specifically on here. It's just a trick that I've seen used on some other stuff in the past.
Yeah, that's a good idea, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just reading this one here from David asking, should each object that is displayed have its own root? For example, each floating window, each message box. They're not pages, but floating GUI components.
Yeah, that's a good question, because the sort of single page application model has these lots of different floating things that don't necessarily fit in the sort of traditional pattern. So I think it's a bit of a judgment call on your application in particular. I think if you want your users to be able to refresh the page and have everything open as it was, then they need to have their own routes. And whether that is, for example, in this application, which is not something I have done, I sort of took out the scope, was that if you click compose twice, you lose the first one. And so what I plan to do, but sort of decided to take it out just for brevity, was to maintain, rather than being a 4 there, it would be 4 and a 3 in an array format or something, so that you could have multiple items that match the same route. And that is probably the case if you've got floating windows that are representative of the same sort of thing. You know, it's 2 drafts, but they're different items, or they're 2 users, they're different, but they're different users, and you want to maintain those as individual routes. Then you'd have to go down the route of that sort of thing, so that you can maintain multiple things within the same route, multiple IDs within the same route. So should they have their own routes? Yes, if you want to open them, you know, and have them deep linked, they should only. But if you have multiple things of the same type that would follow the same route, then you have to do a bit of work to maintain a sort of list of IDs that match the route, rather than just being a single ID.
Okay, I think we've got through most of the questions that have been posted through today. A couple of duplicate ones that we've covered. So I think you know, if I've missed anything and you're desperate for it to be answered, then please go ahead quickly and post it in. Otherwise, I see we are at kind of the top of the hour. Other than that, just leaves me to say thank you, Stuart. Been a really, really interesting session. A lot of good interaction and some great enhancement to the app that we've been writing over the last few weeks as a sample. And again, a few comments in the chat saying thanks. It's kind of really useful working through a kind of a progressive project, so they can see the stages that are relevant to them as developers and how that kind of feeds back. So that's great feedback, guys. Thank you very much. Is there anything that you want to finish off by saying before we close out?
No, just thanks a lot for joining. It's good to have some questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some things. Anything else, as Stephen said, just ping me an email. You can find me. That's I think you pasted emails, didn't you? So yeah, feel free to get in touch.
Okay, well, look, happy coding, everybody, and thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Sencha Cafe. Take care, everyone. Thank you.